All right, for part two of Cold War, we will be looking at the rise of the CIA and where the CIA gets involved, and we'll be focusing on the Korean War. The purpose of part two here is to demonstrate how the US still continues to get involved all around the world despite just being in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. After World War II, we enter into this period of decolonization that begins immediately after the war. And this is also known as the Age of Nationalism. This happens after the war for a few reasons. One, the European powers that control the globe have severely weakened economies, and they can no longer afford to be spread so thin across the globe. In addition, the abuses and atrocities committed as part of imperialism looks very bad now, especially after the crimes of the Japanese and particularly the crimes of the Nazis are revealed to the world. So this is where we see new world powers take over the old world powers, and that would be the United States and the Soviet Union. If we go back in time, we see the era of discovery, which begins with Columbus and lasts until the early part of the 19th century, where European powers are expanding across the globe. Well, then we move into another era in world history, just the era of imperialism, where a handful of European nations dominate the globe. And it's from about 1850 until the end of World War II, where again, just a few of these Western European nations, and you know them, these are the usual suspects, they control at one point about 80% of the entire planet Earth. And after 1945, with their weakened economies and the crimes of the Axis revealed, we move into this age of nationalism, which again starts in 1945. That means we're entering a period in time where many nations around the world, particularly Asia and Africa, are starting to experience independence for the first time in a long time. In addition to that, you have some nations like the Middle East or Latin America who may not have experienced outright colonization, but they were largely influenced and subjugated by European nations. And now that's starting to change as well. So how does this process of decolonization affect the Cold War? Because unfortunately for nations like, Somalia and the Congo and Guatemala and Nicaragua and Iran and the Philippines and Vietnam and so forth and so on, all these nations that are experiencing nationalism after World War II are experiencing it at the same time that there is a Cold War between the US and the Soviets. And as these new nations rise up to join the other world nations, they are forced to take a side. Are you with me or against me? Are you allies of the Americans or allies of the Soviets? And what we'll go on to appreciate is that a lot of these nationalists, whether they be in Vietnam or Korea or Cuba or India or Guatemala or wherever, they're really just interested in their own nation's independence, their own nation's economic security. But because they sort of come of age during the Cold War, they are forced to pick a side. They're brought into a fight that is not their fight. And that's actually where the hot wars exist. So what this map is showing us is where you're likely, or where we did see warfare or use of covert employment, whether it be the KGB or the CIA. So this map is showing you the blue states are allied with the United States, and the red states are allied with the Soviet Union. China's in pink because it's sort of its own separate nation from the Soviet Union. It's not a satellite of the Soviet Union, but it is a communist nation, so they made the colors similar. And then you'll notice that in some of the blue states, you see little red X's. Those are communist guerrillas. So there are guerrilla movements in those nations attempting to overturn U.S. allied governments in favor of communism. And then there are states that are red, thus allied with the Soviet Union in some way, and they'll have little blue X's. And those are anti-communist guerrillas who are trying to overthrow a communist-aligned government in favor of a U.S.-aligned government. And so there are these nations all over the world who, quite frankly, don't give a crap about Cold War issues. They don't care about the Americans and the Soviets. They care about themselves. But this is a world where you have to choose, right? If you need funding, if you need military protection, you're going to have to go to one or the other. And the moment you accept funding from the U.S., you immediately become an enemy of the Soviet Union. The moment you accept support from the Soviet Union, you immediately become an enemy of the United States. And so we're going to look at some of these places that this Cold War drama actually bled into. So we'll start with China. Remember, the goal is to contain communism. Don't allow it to spread outside of the Soviet Union. So that doesn't happen. It begins to spread into a very large country, China. And that's because China has been going through what's known as the Chinese Civil War, which breaks out first in 1927, and it lasts all the way until the communist victory in 1950. And to the left here, you see Chiang Kai-shek. He is the head of the Republic of China, or the Kuomintang, or the KMT, as it's also called, the KMT. And Chiang Kai-shek's government is not particularly popular. There is a lot of corruption within it. It's pretty anti-democratic. It does have the support of the United States, who pretty much prefer anything that's not communist. And we have a lot of very wealthy landlords in China who take advantage of just millions of peasants. So he's part of this kind of elite government that is not enjoyed by the masses. The other side of the Civil War is the Communist Party of China, or the CPC, and that is ran by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong had a much more popular argument, and communism, again, is a government that makes sense in a nation like China. You have millions of people living in poverty, and here comes Mao Zedong, who's like, how about this? I'm going to kill your landlord, we'll take his property, I'll spread it equally, and everybody will be happy. There will be rainbows as far as you can see. And so, of course, you're like, totally, Mao Zedong, you're the greatest. So we have this very long and extremely bloody civil war, that lasts for, more than 20 years. It even kind of was on and off during World War II. They attempted to create a peace during World War II to fight the Japanese. But even through World War II, they fought a little bit. And the moment World War II comes to an end, they're back at it again, right? The KMT and the CPC are fighting one another. Well, the United States had attempted to assist the KMT, the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's government, because they prefer anything that's not communist. And in fact, under the Truman administration between 1945 to 1949, the United States provided $2 billion to Chiang Kai-shek's government so that he could continue to fight against Mao Zedong. But he's not really winning. Truman decides this guy's not worth it, pulls the money, right? Without that funding, Mao Zedong's Communist Party just spreads and spreads, winning more and more battles. In addition, after World War II, the Soviets, who of course want to see Mao Zedong, the communist, win, begin to supply the CPC with money, the Communist Party with money, and more notably with weapons. The Soviets confiscated a bunch of weapons from the Japanese in Manchuria, and they just handed them over to the CPC. So, What ends up happening is October 1950, we have the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek and the creation of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, which exists today. The governments of the Republic of China, the Kuomintang, they were forced to flee, and they flee famously to Taiwan. And even to today, to an extent, they claim to be, or they call themselves, the Republic of China in Taiwan. So Taiwan, for many years, considered themselves to be the real, legitimate government of China, simply in exile. But the point is that communism is spreading, and it's spread to this very large nation with millions of people. So containment doesn't appear to be working. This makes Truman very unpopular. And, now that hindsight's 2020, Republicans begin to accuse him that he should have provided more support to Chiang Kai-shek. All over the papers, you would see the phrase how Truman, quote unquote, lost China, that you gave up on China, and now communism is spreading. And now Red Communist China just so happens to border Korea. And Korea is in its own trouble. See, during the war in the Pacific, if you recall, as part of the Tehran Conference Agreement, Stalin promised that 90 days after the defeat of the Nazis, he would turn the Red Army around and open up a second front against Japan and assist the United States in defeating Japan. Well, he did that. On May 8th, we have the formal Nazi surrender, and on August 8th, he begins his invasion into Manchuria, fighting against the Japanese. The U.S. do not want the Japanese surrendering to the Soviets. That's part of the argument that gets us into why we dropped the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so the Japanese surrender to us. Now, as part of Operation Downfall, which was the planned full-scale invasion into Japan itself, Soviet and American troops began preparing for that operation in Korea. So Soviet troops had moved down from China and were stationing themselves in North Korea. And Americans, as part of the island hopping campaign, had moved up to South Korea and were stationing themselves there for the planned invasion. Well, that invasion never occurs. Now the war comes to an end, and we have Soviet troops in North Korea, American troops in South Korea, and neither of them are willing to leave because we have immediately entered into a Cold War. So, later that year, December 1945, we have another war conference, the Moscow Conference. And it's at the Moscow Conference that Americans and Soviets admit that they're not really friends, right? Because up to this point, the last few months, the Americans are like, you should totally leave North Korea. And the Soviets were like, no, we're good, we'll stay. But hey, you should leave the South. And we were like, no, we think we'll stay. And so there's just this weird standoff. So finally, in December 1945, they're like, because we're in a Cold War, right? So they agree that they're not going to be leaving. And instead, at the Moscow Conference, they decide we will partition Korea along the 38th parallel. Right, so we're going to divide Korea in half, and we will have a Soviet-run Korea in the north and an American-ran Korea in the south. And then they said, but eventually we want Korea to be a free and independent nation. So after 5 years, we will allow the Korean people to have free elections, and they can decide for themselves if they want the government of North Korea or the government of South Korea to be their new leaders. So immediately, puppet governments are set up in the North and the South. In the North, we have a very popular guy, Kim Il-sung, who will help to create the Communist Party there in North Korea. He also led a march taking refugees away from the incoming Japanese. He also worked to secure weapons so that the Koreans could attempt to fight against the Japanese. So he's pretty well respected, particularly amongst the poor. Again, communism is a very popular ideology if you live in crap, right? So in the north, we have this communist regime under Kim Il-sung, who is actually the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Jong-un. And Kim Jong-un, along with his father, both of them tried to emulate the exact look of Kim Il-sung because he's so popular, right? From the haircut even, and that's why you still see even Kim Jong-un has the same haircut as his father, who had the same haircut as his grandfather. They were both trying to emulate the popularity of the original Kim. In the South, the U.S. Created government under Syngman Rhee. This was not a particularly popular government. In fact, Koreans were so upset about the partitioning of their nation that we have in 1946 what's known as the Autumn Uprising, where Koreans protest the partition of their nation, particularly in the South, and the setting up of this puppet government under Syngman Rhee. That eventually spreads, and the United States is forced to come in along with South Korean police to suppress protesters, and eventually thousands of people are killed. You have Koreans killing Koreans here in the South as a way to uphold this US-backed government in Seoul. And again, things get even worse when we have the creation of the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, because now it appears that communism has the ability to actually spread south into Korea. Now, both the Soviets and the Americans don't want a war in Korea. So the North Koreans under Kim were going to the Chinese and to the Soviets saying, back us in a war, back us in a war. We want to invade past the 38th and reconnect the nation. And the South Koreans were saying to the Americans, back us up, we want to invade north across the 38th and reconnect our nation. But both the Americans, the Chinese, and the Soviets were kind of saying, no, 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 we all don't want to get pulled into what could potentially be a world war over Korea. So that's this cartoon is kind of saying here that the South Koreans and the North Koreans sort of had these sponsored nations. So that's all fine and good, except that our Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was making a speech in 1950, or actually he was addressing the press, and the press asked him about Korea, right? He's the Secretary of State, so he deals with foreign affairs. And they're like, oh, what's going on here? What's going on there? And they're like, hey, what's going on with Korea? Like, are you seriously going to like drag us into another war over Korea? And Dean Acheson says, no, don't even worry about it. And he said, we have, quote, no strategic interests in Korea, unquote. So he basically says very publicly that the United States is not really that interested in Korea. That signals to the Soviet Union that potentially, if they allowed North Korea to cross the 38th and invade South Korea to unite the two Koreas, that the United States might not be willing to do anything about it. So the Soviets give a thumbs up, the Chinese give a thumbs up, and we see the North Koreans invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950, crossing the 38th parallel. And they did so in a very big way. They came with about 280 tanks. There were 210 air divisions. And as they roll in, we see attacks of these sort of northern South Korean towns and massacres of civilians as well. The South Koreans were not really prepared for this. They begin to mount a force, but eventually are pushed all the way down to their southern tip. The capital of Seoul is also lost to North Korea as well. So Truman is like, this is some bullshit, right? I can't believe they invaded the 38th. We're going to do something about this, right? Because not only did I fail to contain communism out of China, but now it's bleeding into North Korea. I'll be damned if it bleeds into South Korea. So despite Dean Akinson's assessment that we had no strategic interests, the president disagreed. Now, Harry Truman doesn't want a war from Congress. He's also a little not certain if he'll get it. Congress is made up of Republicans who don't like him very much right now. So instead, he does something unique. He goes to the United Nations because the United Nations has the ability to create policing action, right? Where all the member nations, if they support it, can put together sort of this international army to go, do their work around the world. So Truman goes to the United Nations and he requests police action against North Korea, arguing that North Korea has ignored this international line and that the international community should do something about it. Now, for police action to occur, you need all the permanent members of the Security Council to agree to it. Because again, any one veto could drop it, could kill a bill. So obviously, if Truman goes to the UN and requests police action against North Korea, China or the Soviets might veto it. Except when China defeated the CMT or the KMT in 1949 and become official by 1950, they were not able to take their seat at the UN. Taiwan continued to hold the Chinese seat at the United Nations because they continued to argue that they're the legitimate government. And many other nations within the UN agreed. In fact, it wasn't until I think 1971 that China, or the People's Republic of China, was actually able to take the seat at the UN. So that means the Chinese vote was actually from Taiwan. And Taiwan's like, yeah, go after him. We hate him. At the same time, the Soviets were so upset that the People's Republic of China, was not being given their seat at the UN. In an act of protest, the Soviet diplomats stopped showing up for meetings, including the meeting where they could have vetoed police action. So if you see the UN picture here at the bottom left, everybody's raising their hands supporting police action. Aye. And then we have an empty seat at the table. And that's because sometimes boycotting works, but sometimes by boycotting, you're not there to create action. The Soviet Union was not there to veto this, so police action is passed. Now, the joke about UN troops, however, is that they're usually, or they had been at least at this point, mainly American troops and like a British guy. But we do see 14,000 British that will serve in the Korean War as well. So technically, it's not the American Korean War, it's the UN Korean War. So the UN approves those forces and the Korean War begins. 327,000 Americans will be sent off to Korea. They will assist about 600,000 South Koreans, and again, those additional 14,000 British. And they'll go up against 1.3 million North Koreans and the Soviets, who are mostly just sending advisors and material. So we're starting to see a trend here where we can send people off to war, Americans off to war, and Americans will die in Korea, and they did so without any formal declaration by Congress. In fact, World War II was the last formal declaration of war that we've seen. That doesn't mean that every military action since World War II has been illegal. Congress has given the presidents the right to use the forces as they see fit. So this was done in Vietnam, where Congress basically says, we're not declaring war, but we're giving Lyndon B. Johnson the power to command his troops as he sees fit. The same thing happens after 9/11. We have a couple pieces of legislation where Congress is not technically declaring war, but they're giving the President George W. Bush in that case, the ability to command the troops as he sees fit to go after the plotters of 9/11. So we're starting to see this tradition where we don't really see formal declarations of war anymore. So the Korean War basically works in 4 major phases. First, North Korea attacked there in June of 1950, crossing the 38th. They take Seoul, and they actually move all the way down to that bottom right corner. The Americans attempt an invasion. The first one fails badly. The second one's this massive amphibious assault under the leadership of General MacArthur. So MacArthur, again, is the commander from the war in the Pacific during World War II. He's seated there at the top. So he leads this massive amphibious assault, which is something he's used to doing, right, as part of the Pacific campaign. And he's able to launch this invasion into South Korea. Very quickly, troops are pushed all the way back up to the 38th parallel, thus completing the goal of containment. So once MacArthur was able to take those North Koreans, which had expanded beyond their border, and he pushes them back into North Korea, containment has been achieved, right? Because again, the goal of containment is just to prevent it from spreading. Well, it spread into South Korea, so we pushed it back up. But that happened so quickly that MacArthur thinks to himself, he's standing there at the border of the 38th, and he thinks to himself, well, crap, that was pretty easy. Maybe I should just keep on going. So he does. He crosses the 38th parallel on October 1st, 1950, thus initiating a policy of rollback. Now we want to appreciate that the reason he feels like he can do this is because he moved through South Korea. He achieved containment pretty quickly. That first amphibious landing that was successful, that occurs in September of 1950. So in a matter of weeks, he has taken back all of South Korea. And he's like, holy crap, that was super easy. But as he gets closer to the 38th parallel, on September 30th, 1950, he receives a warning from the People's Republic of China. And they're like, hey, MacArthur, you're getting kind of close to the 38th parallel. Don't you dare cross it. If you cross the 38th parallel into North Korea, then we, the Chinese, will come down and support North Korea. Well, MacArthur receives that message. He's like, I think we'll be fine. And he orders there on October 1st, 1950, the crossing of the 38th. This not only angers China because MacArthur did not heed their warning, but it occurs on their anniversary as well, right? Just as the PRC is being created, because again, the PRC was officially created there in October of 1949, and now we're seeing that anniversary in 1950. So he moves into North Korea. He's like, we should just keep this going. And so he's now attempting to roll back communism by pushing it out of North Korea and back up into China. He's so confident that he can do this quickly, he tells the press, don't even worry about it, our boys will be home by Christmas. So he expected, because he took South Korea in weeks, that he could take North Korea in just a couple months. Well, Christmas comes and goes, and the next one comes and goes, and the next one comes and goes. And we are stuck in Korea. Korea does not officially come to an end until 1953, because we're going to get bogged down there in North Korea. And the reason is China was not bluffing. As MacArthur moves closer up toward North Korea, the Chinese pour across the border with tanks, with these Japanese weapons that had been taken after the war, and with 266,000 men just pouring across the border to assist the North Koreans. And so that Chinese invasion will force the Americans back down south. And we ironically sort of see something that we saw in World War I. The rest of the war from 1951 until it ends in 53 is really just this stalemate fighting around the 38th, this back and forth. The Chinese and North Koreans cannot completely push the Americans down south, and the Americans cannot completely push the North Koreans and the Chinese back north. And so we have these little movements, this back and forth for the next few years. And if you recall in World War I, nobody likes a stalemate war, right? It is seriously demoralizing. So here's another visual of the war. Again, there in June 1950, we have the crossing of the 38th by North Korea. They make it super far south, basically taking all of South Korea, including the capital of Seoul. We have that same month in September, a very successful invasion, amphibious invasion into the northern part of South Korea, which you can see there, that eventually allows us to, in a matter of weeks, push all of the North Korean forces out of South Korea. Then on September 30th, as MacArthur is nearing the 38th, he gets that warning from the Chinese, do not enter. He does, crosses that line on October 1st. And as you can see here too, pretty quickly he's able to start moving up towards China. But as he gets too close to that border, we see that full-scale invasion, and that's going to push the Americans back down to the 38th, where we see that stalemate fighting for the next 2.5 years until the war finally comes to an end in 1953. There's a lot of interesting things about the Korean War. It is such a launching pad of where we've been and where we're going. It's not brought up a lot, which is weird to me. It's often referred to as the Forgotten War, and that's because it exists within the middle of World War II and Vietnam, which are two bigger wars that are studied so much more and known about so much more. So Korean War is often forgot about, and that is a problem because it changes warfare. It is in some ways a combination of World War I and World War II. We see this similar kind of amphibious assaults, the use of smaller units like we saw in World War II, but we also see this stalemate fighting like we see in World War I. We see some new things, the helicopter there and the corner right. In the corner left, this is the first war where we will use jet-fueled engines, or the jet. So aerial warcraft is rapidly changing and getting more technologically advanced because of the Korean War. Up in the upper right, you see aerial bombing of major infrastructure in North Korea. That's very similar to what we've seen in World War II, right? Target the cities, target the infrastructure. But what you see in the upper left here, we also see a new kind of fighting, something we experienced in the Filipino-American Wars, a little bit more of guerrilla fighting. We're going to see the rise of more elite units and elite American forces here. As we move on, we'll see the creation of the SEALs, which becomes famous in Vietnam, actually starts here in the Korean War. The Rangers, Army Rangers, which technically have a history that goes back to the French and Indian War. The Rangers are also famous for their actions in Vietnam, but they start here in the Korean War. The 101 Airborne Division, which becomes famous in later wars, starts here in the Korean War. So again, we see a combination of big strategies, grand strategies like in World War II, but also smaller and more precise goals like what we're going to start to see in Vietnam. as a way to attempt to combat guerrilla movements. So rather than, again, sending 1 million men across a battlefield like we did so long ago, now we're starting to focus on more mobile, smaller units, and particularly these elite units within the branches of the military. We will eventually see 2 million Korean deaths in this war. In Korea, North Korea, it's known as the Great Fatherland War. So depending on what country you're in, it has different names. Because the war not only took so many lives in terms of people who fought in it, but the back and forth across Korea devastated portions of the landscape, and we see food sources, both purposely through scorched earth, but also impurposely just through, troops marching around. These massive food shortages, which lead to, of course, catastrophic loss of life around the country. So it's often referred to as the Forgotten War, which is a problem, as I've mentioned, for lots of reasons. One, the Korean War tells us where we're going, right, as we start to depend more on smaller, more mobile elite units. We see greater technological precision bombing with the jets. We also see a enormous loss of life. But because Korea, again, exists between those two bigger wars, it is often seen as, the Forgotten War. This is the War Memorial in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., which you can go visit, and it's meant to capture those Americans in North Korea who were marching through the mountains there, through the snow, and this was dedicated in 1995. Another reason why this war, being the Forgotten War, is problematic because many Americans were left behind. This war, as we'll see in a moment, ends with an armistice. It does not end with a formal treaty. Technically speaking, the Korean War is still on. There's never been a formal treaty between us and North Korea ending this war. Because of that, there has never been a formal exchange of prisoners. Both the North and the South executed troops. And this war, if you were an American and you were captured by the North Koreans, you had, I think it's like 43%, it's something close to 50% of Americans who were captured by the North Koreans were likely to be killed as a POW. So this is also one of the worst wars, along with the war in the Pacific, that you could be captured. And so again, because there was never a formal war, there was no formal exchange of prisoners. And there were, and maybe are, we don't know, North Korea is such an isolated country, but there were reports that there were still hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans and South Koreans who were left to just work essentially as slave labor in the North Korean prison system. And so that's what this flag that you may have seen is about. I mean, it's meant to represent sort of a wider problem of POWs that are still missing. But the biggest place we see this becoming a problem is with Korea. Now, when China had invaded across the border to assist North Korea there in late 1950, from 1951 until the war comes to an end in mid-1953, we saw that stalemate fighting. And MacArthur is getting very frustrated. And early on in that last phase of the war, he begins to criticize President Truman. Remember, war journalists are always there. And they are reporting on the war, and they're interviewing MacArthur as the war is going on. They're like, "What's going on, MacArthur? How come you haven't taken North Korea?" And he replies, "Well, it's that damn son of a bitch Truman, right? Truman's micromanaging me. He's not letting me see this war over as I see fit." And specifically, the problem was that MacArthur had requested an atom bomb. He's like, I don't know why I have to sit here and fight these people. I'm losing a lot of men, right? This is absurd. I should be able to easily take North Korea. For God's sakes, we have an atom bomb. Now, this is still 1950, 1951. We don't have the hydrogen bomb until 1952. So that's why we're still talking about the atom bomb here. And so he makes a request to Truman, hey man, give me an atom bomb. Let's drop one bomb on North Korea and this whole war will be over. We'll save lots of American lives. And at first Truman's like, well, okay. And he starts to move atom bombs that they have, right? Because again, as part of the NSC 68 report, they had begun to build more atom bombs. So he begins that process, but then the European allies hear about this and they're like, dude, don't like move atom bombs around. All you're going to do is scare the crap out of the Soviets and they're going to end up targeting your friends, which is me, right? If you hit Soviet friends, they're going to hit your friends, which is me. I don't want to get hit with an atom bomb, says London, says Paris, right? So another thing that they had considered doing was just doing a show of force, like a show of the big stick. And so they were going to do a practice drop of an atom bomb off of Okinawa as a demonstration to the North Koreans, like, this is what's up. You better stop what you're doing. But then the Japanese complained. They're like, are you serious? We don't enjoy atom bombs. We have a history with them. They're bad. Also, if you do that, then what do you think's going to happen? The Chinese or the Soviets will do the same thing to us. So Truman begins to fear that if he uses an atom bomb or even demonstrates an atom bomb, then the Soviets might retaliate by targeting one of our friends, one of our allies like the Japanese or Western Europe. So he decides not to do that. And this pisses off MacArthur, right? He feels like he's being micromanaged. And you have to appreciate the war from his side. He's seeing these men fall every day, and it's frustrating. So he starts bad-mouthing Truman to the press. That leads Truman to fire MacArthur in 1951. This is a big deal. This is not some average Joe general. This is General MacArthur. He won the war in the Pacific. He came back and saved the Philippines. The reason Japan is an ally of ours is because of MacArthur. MacArthur stayed in Japan, worked with the Japanese, had them create a new constitution. He pushes to keep the emperor in place, all that stuff. So to fire this exceptionally popular guy further makes Truman unpopular. Truman's already unpopular for having, quote unquote, lost China. Now he fired the famed MacArthur. The Senate does do an investigation of this firing, and they argued actually that Truman acted correctly because what MacArthur had done by bad-mouthing his boss to the press was the equivalent of insubordination. So MacArthur's out. He'll be replaced with another general, Matthew Ridgway, who sees out the rest of the Korean War. But Truman's out too. So Truman had already served the majority of FDR's term, and then he ran again on his own in 48 and ran and won another 4 years. So now he is going to step down, and we'll talk about the 22nd Amendment in a little bit, and Eisenhower will become the next president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, nobody really knew what his politics were, so whenever they would ask him, like, where do you lean politically, he would always just reply, like, I'm a soldier, not a politician. And the Democrats were hoping desperately that he would be a Democrat, and the Republicans were hoping desperately that he was a Republican, because if he ever chooses to run for office, he's a shoo-in. He's a freaking war hero. He's the guy that oversaw D-Day, right? He's freaking, very, very popular. Well, he becomes very upset with Truman for, the Korean War and for China, so he decides to run for the presidency. he kind of comes out of the political closet, so to speak, and he's like, I'm a Republican. And the Republicans are like, yes, because that means they just won the White House. So he becomes president in 1953. And under Dwight D. Eisenhower, we have the July 27th, 1953 armistice. So an armistice, again, is just an agreement to lower weapons. It is not a formal peace treaty. And the armistice agreed that we'll just go back to the way things were. So the war ends with containment. So you can argue that the Korean War was successful if our only goal was to contain communism outside of South Korea, but if the goal was to roll it back, that was a failure. So in North Korea, we see both the policies of rollback and containment, and Eisenhower becomes aware that rollback appears to be a failure. And as president, he's going to focus more on containing communism. So what's sad about the Korean War is that it ends in the same way it sort of began, with the same partition near the 38th parallel. In this war, again, 2 million Koreans died. A great majority of them were from the north, and we lost 36,500 Americans. Again, making that phrase, the Lost War, kind of annoying. And the 38th parallel remains. It is 160 miles long, 2.5 miles wide. It is considered the most dangerous place on Earth. The demilitarized zone, or the DMZ, as it's often called, is a very famous place. There's this line that's heavily guarded between North Korea and South Korea. Very famously and recently, we saw the leaders of North Korea and South Korea meet, but this is also typically how an early meeting might occur between Americans and the North Koreans as well. So the Korean War is over and Dwight Eisenhower is president. Before Truman leaves office, Congress ratifies the 22nd Amendment, which prevents a president from serving more than 2 full terms. So a president can actually serve realistically up to 10 years because let's say you're vice president and the president dies, so you have to serve out the remainder of his term. Well, if you serve more than half of his term, that's considered a full term. But if you serve less than half of his term, that's not considered a term. So under the 22nd Amendment, you can serve no more than 2 full terms. So you could potentially serve, your 8 years, your 2 4-year terms, plus the 2 years or just under 2 years that the preceding president served. But we haven't really seen that in a while. Typically, we just see presidents, which is a good thing because that would mean presidents are dying in office. But today, of course, now it is law or constitutional law that presidents must step down after 2 terms. And this is obviously in reaction to FDR, who was president for, just over 12 years. So Eisenhower is technically the first president to be elected with the 22nd Amendment in place. So he was exceptionally popular. He probably could have ran for a 3rd term and won, but now it's law, so he steps down. Every president that stepped down after 2 terms prior to this did so solely because it was precedent, because that's what George Washington famously did. So Eisenhower has seen what world wars look like. They're not pretty. He wants to avoid them if he can. And so rather than have giant grand goals and strategies to defeat the Soviet Union, he has small or limited goals. And to achieve those small goals, he wants to use small tools. His limited goal is containment, right? He is the one who signs the armistice ending Korea. He saw how rollback into North Korea failed and it killed thousands of Americans. and hundreds of thousands of Koreans. If rollback had never been attempted, and if we never crossed the 38th parallel and simply tried to contain communism in South Korea, that war would have been over in a couple weeks, right? So for him, we just want to contain communism from spreading elsewhere. Now, we also want to use limited tools in our goal of containing communism. And that certainly means conventional weapons are preferred to, say, a hydrogen bomb, as we've seen in this cartoon. But that also means use of the CIA. Now, again, the CIA was created as part of the National Security Act while Truman was still president. But we really don't see the CIA being used in a big way until Eisenhower. I mean, the moment this guy steps in the White House, he prefers to use the CIA. For him, using the CIA is better because it's cheaper. You're going to get a lot lower loss of life, right? You don't have to worry about thousands of people being killed. And there's no accountability, right? Eisenhower's, in some cases, Eisenhower's just going to play stupid, like, well, I don't know how that spy plane got there. That's weird, right? So the CIA is going to be used by Eisenhower. For him, it's just easier because if I want to take out a foreign leader, I can drop 5 guys in from a spy plane in the black of night, and they'll have the job done before sunrise. Or I can send in 1 million men in a massive amphibious assault. And Eisenhower's like, ugh, I'm so sick of big wars. Let's just stick with the CIA. Now, because this period of decolonization is occurring at the same time as the Cold War, where is Eisenhower going to send the CIA? Well, his goal is to contain it, so any time a new nation, that is achieving independence for the first time in a long time, joins the world, if it appears to be leaning to the left, if it appears to be an ally of the Soviet Union, that's the nation that Eisenhower is going to send the CIA. To make things even more interesting, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, who you see with him there at the bottom left, was John Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles' brother, to the right, is Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA. So we have this little tripod of Eisenhower who's focused on, because of his experiences, on using this limited tool of the CIA, working with the Secretary of State, whose brother is the head of the CIA. So as they look at the world, every nation that, tips its head to the sun like, ooh, I'm a brand new nation, right? They are entering into a Cold War, and both the Americans and the Soviets will try to either coddle them over or force them over. And every time one of these guys sees one of these nations leaning in a way we don't like, doing leftist things, doing socialist or communist things, that's where they're going to start sending the CIA. And so we'll look at some examples of that. The first place where the CIA is used in a very grand way is that same year that Eisenhower enters the White House in 1953. So the concerns for this actually begin a little bit sooner. See, during World War II, the Shah of Iran, who's like the king of Iran, was forced into exile, and a Republican parliamentary government was set up. And the first elected leader of Iran by the parliament was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was elected in 1951. And as leader, he wants to support, of course, the Iranian people. And part of the problem with that is a lot of the Iranian natural resources, like oil, have been controlled or at least influenced by European powers, specifically the British. So Mohammad Mossadegh works with the British, and he proposes to them the 50-50 plan. He says, hey, Britain, how about if I keep 50% of my oil, which I will nationalize and I'll use to, create an even spread of wealth across the Iranian people. And you can have the other 50% of my oil. And the British, who were used to a hell of a lot more than that, replied or countered with the 2080 plan. They said, how about actually if we take 80% of your oil and you can keep 20%? And Mossadegh's like, I feel like I was being pretty freaking cool with the 50-50 plan. So how about this? I'm going to keep it all. I'm going to nationalize all Iranian oil fields, which just means claim all resources to be Iranian. And now the British are like, oh crap, we lost our oil. So they go to the Americans and they're like, hey, America, did you notice that Iran borders the Soviet Union? And we're like, oh, that's interesting. And they're like, yeah, aren't you guys trying to contain communism? And they're like, yeah, we're doing it. We're totally doing it. And the British are like, are you sure? Because this guy, Mossadegh, he wants to nationalize oil fields and spread the wealth to the poor. That sounds a little socialist, doesn't it? And we were like, holy crap, Mossadegh's a communist, right? We are not containing Soviet Union. These Soviet ideologies have already entered Iran. So we should support a Western-backed leadership. The CIA enters Iran and begin to print leaflets encouraging or at least making the argument that there is large-scale protesting against Mossadegh. So they basically invent a coup. They even hire members of what essentially equates to the Iranian mafia, as well as pay off members of the Iranian military to stage a coup and make it look like there's this huge protest against Mossadegh. It works. 500 Iranians are killed in the process. Mossadegh is taken out of office. He's placed under house arrest as an enemy of the state, actually dies under house arrest. And he is replaced with the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. So Pahlavi is not well liked by the Iranian people. He will be in power into the 1970s. He lived in extraordinary luxury, as did his wife. He immediately signs over a lot of the natural resources to Western powers and supports the United States in any anti-communist activity he needs to do. And in return, the United States, of course, protects his position as the Shah of Iran. But the Iranian people do not like him. And this becomes apparent when the Ayatollah Khomeini, or the supreme religious leader of Iran, helps to mobilize mass support in Iran, resulting in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which also leads us toward the Iranian hostage situation under the Carter administration, in which Iranian students, fueled by this hatred for the United States and their protection of the Shah, storm the U.S. Embassy and take Americans there, hundreds of them, as hostages for a year until Ronald Reagan takes the presidency. So this is kind of our background with Iran. And obviously, we still have strained relations, to say the least. But this was an easy way, while Iran knew exactly what happened to them, especially under the Ayatollah, the United States is able to just be like, well, look at that. The Iranian people like the Shah of Iran. And so again, the CIA allows us to flip governments with very little accountability, loss of life, and it's pretty inexpensive. So Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers were like, well, that worked. Let's see if we have any other problems. Well, there was a problem. In 1954, in Guatemala, we have the elected president of Guatemala, who you see here, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. And he is looking to sort of do the same thing that Mossadegh did with oil in Iran, except he wants to do it with land. See, a lot of the land in Guatemala is controlled by foreign nations, most notably the United States, most notably the United Fruit Company. So United Fruit Company owns a lot of land or controls a lot of land around Central and Southern America for the purpose of growing and bringing in fruit, especially bananas. So the Chiquita banana, right? These are also referred to the earlier banana wars. So Guzman wants to nationalize lands in Guatemala so that he can help to provide land for the poor. Well, the United Fruit Company refused to give up their land. And so Guzman just finally says, well, I'm going to be forced to kick you out, right? And he takes about 85% of their lands on which a lot of bananas are grown. And the United Fruit Company complains. They're like, hey, man, we've been on this land for a long time. And so Guzman says, okay, I'll pay you for this land. I'll pay you for my own land. But I'm going to pay you based on what the property taxes are worth. So show me your taxes that you've been paying, and I'll pay you that. And the United Fruit Company's like, ew. And Guzman knew exactly what he was doing. Not only had the United Fruit Company been taking all of this land from Guatemala, but they were evading Guatemalan taxes to grow fruit on that land. So they hadn't been paying taxes, which means the amount that Guzman would have to pay them was zero. So the United Fruit Company says, we don't agree with that assessment. Give us $16 million for this land. And Guzman's like, that's adorable. No. So the United Fruit Company, which of course is a company within the United States, goes to the CIA and they're like, isn't it interesting that this guy, Guzman, wants to nationalize the lands and spread the wealth to the poor? Doesn't that sound a little socialist? And we're like, holy crap, he's a communist. So the CIA goes in. They do the same thing. They invent a coup. He is forced into exile, and he will be replaced with Castillo Armas, who you see there with Nixon. And Armas will be a long-time ally in Guatemala of the United States because he helps to create this extreme right-wing military dictatorship that was devastating for the Guatemalans. But he kept a close relationship with the United States. He fought off communist guerrillas within Central America, and so he's kept in power. What happens in Guatemala becomes a little more public, and much of Latin America goes back to completely hating us. Because under FDR, we created the good neighbor policy, which said we're not going to do the whole dollar diplomacy thing anymore. We're not going to do, the whole controlling Latin America, Western hemisphere world police or anything like that. We'll try to be nice to our Latin American nations. Well, what happened here in Guatemala kind of destroyed the good neighbor policy. It was a complete abandonment of it. And already here in the 1950s, according to some nations, the U.S. is beginning to lose its high moral ground, which it had gained fighting in World War I. In addition to this, we see the U.S. going to the Congo in 1960, which had also achieved its independence. And the first elected prime minister of the Congo was Patrice Lumumba. Well, he, as a new nation, was looking for assistance. He actually does reach out to the U.S., but is largely ignored. Members within his government convince him to talk to the Soviet Union. So then he actually begins to get weapons and funding from the Soviet Union. Well, we don't like this at all. So the CIA ends up assisting Belgians as well as right-winged members within the Congolese army to overthrow Lumumba, he is captured by that army and eventually executed. And Lumumba was replaced with a lovely guy, Joseph Mobutu, who you might be aware of. He was devastating for Congo for a very long time. His little hat's famous. And presidents from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan, who you see here, to Nixon, even Jimmy Carter, you see pictures of him shaking his hand, because Mobutu stayed an anti-communist ally of the United States throughout the Cold War. So we were willing to support right-wing dictators as long as they weren't communists. We do this in other places too, like the Dominican Republic. We helped to overthrow Rafael Trujillo in 1961, although he was bad. He was a dictator who had committed this ethnic cleansing against Haitians, so we removed him as sort of a problem child within Latin America. We do the same thing in Brazil in 1964. This socialist leader takes over. The CIA encourages street raids against him, provided arms. He's eventually forced into exile. In Chile, we do the same thing in 1973. There is a socialist candidate for the president in 1970. We push him out and ensure that Augusto Pinochet, who maybe you've heard of, wins the presidency, and he goes on to do the things that he does in Chile. So we see these kinds of actions all over the world. Some of the people we overthrow were bad people, but some of the people we replace them with were equally bad as well. Now, just like we had the Truman Doctrine, which said the Americans will assist any free peoples faced with subjugation around the world. It was very all-encompassing. It made us sort of the world policemen. Then comes the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957. It's much more specific, and it demonstrates a growing interest in the Middle East. So this was largely in reaction to the Iranian coup, that the U.S. does have an interest in what's happening in the Middle East, especially as we begin to continue to support our Israeli ally. The Eisenhower Doctrine says that American forces will assist any nation in the region, and he meant the Middle East, requiring aid against armed aggression from communist nations. The Eisenhower Doctrine eventually pulls us into covert assistance for the Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviets in the 1970s invade Afghanistan, and it ends up being sort of their Vietnam War. They get bogged down in this very long, very bloody, and very expensive war in Afghanistan. We want to ensure that Afghanistan can fight back against the Soviet Unions, and so covertly we begin to provide weaponry to the Afghans, allowing them to eventually kick out the Soviets. However, we ended up accidentally arming the people who would eventually go on to form the Taliban in Afghanistan as well. So what we're seeing as early as 1950s is a growing interest within the Middle East. The Cold War is a huge history that's sort of impossible to cover, in my opinion, in just a few hours. So I've tried to give us key points, but the history really continues into the 1970s and the 1980s in really important ways. In the next section, we'll be focusing specifically on Cuba and Vietnam and how those wars, as part of the overall Cold War, also changes our history. But I'll leave you with this idea, since one of our big goals is to understand how the U.S. becomes this global phenomenon. Because we accept world power after World War II, and we fight in this or are a part of this Cold War ideology, this attempt to prevent and contain the spread of communism sends us all over the world in all sorts of ways. And so that's what we're kind of transitioning to as we enter into the last half of the 20th century. And so here are our IDs for the Cold War. In the next section, we'll be looking again at John F. Kennedy, who goes up against Fidel Castro in Cuba, and then we'll be looking at all the presidents who served during the very long Vietnam War.